Hello everyone, Dr. Michael Llamas here for teaching subjects, and today we will discuss comparative and superlative adverbs. So whether we are discussing actions, qualities, or the degree to which something happens, adverbs are essential for clear, nuanced expressions. Now by the end of this session, you'll understand how to use comparative and superlative forms of adverbs to make your statements more impactful. Now, this knowledge is particularly useful in both written and spoken English because it will help you add clarity and emphasis where it's needed in your sentences. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so let's get started by grounding ourselves in what an adverb actually is. So what is an adverb, you might be asking yourself? So adverbs are words that modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs, and they help us describe how, when, where, or to what extent an action happens. So think of them as the words that add detail, context, or color to our sentences, making our communication more engaging and clearer. There are a few main types of adverbs. There's adverbs of manner, which describes how something is done, like quickly or carefully. Adverbs of time, which tells us when something happens, like yesterday or soon. Adverbs of place, which explains where something happens, such as here or everywhere. And finally, we have adverbs of degree, which indicates to what extent something is done. So words like very, extremely, or barely fall into this category. Now, the purpose of using adverbs is to add precision, variety, and depth to our language. They allow us to be specific and expressive, giving our listeners or readers a clearer picture of what we mean. So as we move through this lesson, we'll see how understanding and using adverbs well can really elevate your communication. So now that we've covered the basics of adverbs, let's focus on two important forms, which are comparative and superlative adverbs. Now these forms helps us make comparisons, which is important for clear and impactful communication. So first let's look at comparative adverbs. Now these adverbs allows us to compare two actions or events. So for instance, if we say she runs faster than her brother, we're comparing how quickly each person runs. Another example could be he spoke more accurately than before. Comparatives are formed by adding er to some adverbs like faster or using more for longer adverbs like more accurately. Then we have superlative adverbs. Now superlatives shows us the highest degree of an action among three or more options. So if I say she runs the fastest of everyone on the team, I'm indicating that she is at the top in terms of speed. Or in another example sentence, we can say he explained it most accurately of all the speakers. We are saying his accuracy was the highest. Now, superlatives often use est endings like fastest or most with longer adverbs like most accurately. So you might be asking yourself, why are these forms important? So comparative and superlative adverbs gives us the ability to express degrees of difference, which adds clarity and emphasis to our communication. So instead of just simply describing an action, we can highlight how it stands out in relation to others. And this not only makes our language richer, but also more precise. Okay, so now that you know what comparative adverbs are, let's look how to form them. Now, the rules vary depending on the length of adverbs, so we'll break them down into two main types, okay? So first we have adverbs that take the er ending. Now this is typically for single syllable adverbs, those short, straightforward words. Okay, so for example, hard becomes harder when we want to compare. So we might say she worked harder than her colleague. This shows a clear comparison between their levels of effort. Next, for adverbs with two or more syllables, we use the word more before the adverb instead of adding an ending. So take quickly, for instance. Instead of trying to add er, we simply say more quickly. Now, an example sentence would be, he spoke more clearly than the other students, which compares his clarity to that of the others. Now, these forms of er for shorter adverbs and more for longer ones helps us create comparisons smoothly and correctly. And as we work with comparative adverbs, it's helpful to remember these patterns as they make our sentences more fluid and more accurate. Okay, so now let's move on to superlative adverbs, which helps us describe the highest degree of an action among three or more options. Now, just like with comparative adverbs, the way we form superlatives depends on the length of the adverb, right? So for single syllable adverbs, we use est to the end. So for instance, hard becomes hardest. If we want to say that someone stands out for their effort, we might say she worked at the hardest in her team, indicating she put the most effort compared to everyone else. So for adverbs with two or more syllables, we use the word most before the adverb. So for example, quickly becomes most quickly. And we could say, for example, in a sentence, he spoke the most clearly during the presentation, suggesting his clarity was unmatched by the other speakers. Now, using superlative adverbs allows us to highlight the peak performance or the highest degree of an action. It's a great way to add emphasis to make our descriptions more memorable. Okay, so now let's talk about some exceptions, right? Because we have irregular, comparative, and then superlative adverbs. Now, unlike the standard forms that we've seen, these adverbs don't follow the usual er or est endings or the addition of more and most. Instead, they change forms completely, so it's important to remember these unique patterns. Okay, so here we have a few of the most common irregular forms to know. So the word well becomes better in the comparative form and best in the superlative form. Now, badly changes to worse for the comparative and worst for the superlative. Then we have the word little, which becomes less in the comparative form, and then least in the superlative form. Okay, so let's see these irregular forms in action with a couple of examples, right? So, she sings better than anyone else in the choir, so where the word better compares her singing qualities to others. Then in the sentence, he drives the worst of all the drivers in his group, indicating he's at the lowest end of the group's driving ability. Then we have in the sentence, he spends less time studying than his classmates, where the word less compares the amount of time he spends studying to others. Now, mastering these irregular forms can add even more depth to your language, and they might seem like small details, but using them correctly really does make a difference in how accurately we express comparisons. Okay, so now that we've gone over the rules and forms of both regular and irregular comparative and superlative adverbs, it's time to kind of put this knowledge into practice, right? So in this slide, we're going to focus on creating a sentence that uses these adverbs to compare actions effectively. We'll start with a basic sentence, then transform it step by step into its comparative and superlative forms. So let's take a look at this example, right? So we have the original sentence, which is, he answered quickly. In the comparative form, we might say, he answered more quickly than she did, right? So comparing his response speed directly with someone else's. In the superlative form, it becomes he answered most quickly of all the participants. Okay, so this shows that his response time was the fastest in the entire group. As we wrap up this lesson, let's look at some common mistakes that people make when using comparative and superlative adverbs. So by being aware of these, you can avoid potential pitfalls and also ensure that your language remains clear and accurate. Okay, so first, using adjective comparatives instead of adverbs. Now, this happens when we accidentally use an adjective form in place of an adverb. So for instance, saying more fast instead of the correct adverb form faster, since we are modifying a verb and not a noun, we need the adverb form faster. Now, second, overusing most and more, right? So we use most and more to create comparisons with longer adverbs, but they are unnecessary for one syllable adverbs. So for example, with the adverb hard, we would say harder and hardest and not more hard or most hard, right? So avoiding these extra words will keep your sentences concise and also grammatically correct. And finally, incorrect irregular forms, right? So this is when we mix up regular and irregular forms, which can lead to errors like using good instead of well, or saying gooder instead of better. Now, irregular adverbs have their own unique forms, so it's important to memorize them and use them correctly. And by keeping these common mistakes in mind, you'll be better prepared to use the comparative and superlative adverbs accurately. Now that we've covered the rules and common mistakes, let's look at some practical tips for using comparative and superlative adverbs effectively in your writing and speaking. So, tip number one is choose the right form based on context, right? So, it's important to understand when to use a comparative adverb versus a superlative one. So, use comparative adverbs when comparing two actions or things, like she runs faster than I do, and on the other hand, use superlative adverbs when comparing three or more actions or things, like he runs the fastest of all the competitors, right? So knowing when to use each form will help you create clear and more precise sentences. Okay, so tip number two is clarity is key. Okay, so don't overuse superlatives. Use them only when there is a clear comparison among three or more actions or people. So, for example, saying he is the most talented writer I know is fine when you're comparing him to others, right? But avoid using superlatives in situations where you're only comparing two things. Better is usually a better choice in these cases. Now, tip number three is practice variety. Okay, so one way to enhance your language is by using different adverbs instead of repeating the same ones over and over. And this not only helps keep your language interesting, but it also helps you convey subtle differences in meanings, right? So, for instance, instead of always saying quickly, you might alternate with swiftly, rapidly, or promptly. Now, this adds depth to your communication. Now, these tips will help you use comparative and superlative adverbs effectively and creatively, right? Enriching your language. So, it's good to keep these in mind. Okay, so just to quickly review what we've covered today. So, we've explored the forms of comparative and superlative adverbs, right? So, how to correctly form them, when to use them in sentences. And we also discussed common mistakes to avoid and shared useful tips for enhancing your language with these adverbs. Now remember, the key to mastering these adverbs is to practice. So the more you use them in context, whether writing or speaking, the more fluent and confident you'll become. So try to incorporate them into your daily communication, and soon enough you'll start feeling it like it's second nature. So before we wrap up, don't forget to like this video, comment below with any thoughts or questions, and subscribe to the channel for more lessons. Thanks for watching.